Okay, so when we talk about multicellularity, we're also going to talk about kind of the history of life a little bit, how things on Earth came to be, okay, things like that. And what I'm going to tell you today is not going to contradict what you learned in religion class. Okay, you guys are like extremely lucky in that you are alive while Pope Francis is here. Okay, because I mean I've had a few popes in my lifetime, not that many, but okay. Pope Francis is a scientist, actually. He has a background in chemistry. So he's very open-minded about the relationship between science and faith. Right? So he has come out, and even if this was the church's standpoint for a very long time. Most people didn't know it, but he's come out and just kind of outright said it. The church doesn't have any problem with the idea of evolution. The church has no problem with the idea of natural selection. These are tools. Okay? God's a smart guy. He would have figured out that the creation he made was dynamic. That means it was going to change. Okay? When he created the earth, it wasn't going to stay that way forever. The processes that he put in place were going to cause changes in it. If he wanted the stuff he put on the earth to survive, he had to give it the ability to adapt. Okay? So when something adapts, that can be selected for or selected against. That's natural selection. That happening over the course of a very long time can cause a change in a population or a change in a species. That's evolution. Okay? The church has no problem with that idea. Okay? People have thought they did for a long time, okay, because there was this group of people who said, yeah, but that means that you believe that apes or humans came from apes. Says specifically on the sixth day God created man. Yes, it does say that. Okay? But what we have to understand is that when we read the Bible, that part of the Bible and many parts of the Bible are not meant to be interpreted literally. Okay? Now, if you are a fundamentalist, that means you believe in the absolute literal truth of the Bible. You'll hate everything I say today. Okay? And I can't help you with that. Okay? Because what I'm teaching you is what the church tells us, which is that not all parts of the Bible are meant to be taken literally, especially Genesis. Okay? When the Bible was written, most people were illiterate. Okay? Their lifestyle was, I got to make enough food to live. I got to find enough food around for my family and myself to live. That is what occupies every waking hour of my day. Okay? It was a very different lifestyle than we have now. We have lots of time now to think about things and come up with new ideas. Okay? They had to think about, how am I going to make food? How am I going to get enough food? Okay? So when the Bible was written, it had to be written in a way that people would accept and understand. Okay? If people had come around and said, so 4.5 billion years ago, all these rocks in space are running into each other and they're creating this big ball, this big molten ball that's eventually going to cool and an atmosphere is going to gather around it as a result. People would have thrown rocks at them until they were dead. Okay? That's what stoning was, by the way. Have you ever heard stoning? They got stoned in the Bible. It doesn't mean the other kind of stone. Okay? It means they got rocks thrown at them until they were dead. Okay? It's a totally different thing. Yeah, it wouldn't have been something that people would have understood or listened to for very long or accepted in any way. Okay? But the people that were around at that time, okay, especially being the Jewish population, 7 days was a sacred amount of time. 1 week was a sacred amount of time. Okay? There's always the Sabbath day, which is the seventh day. Incidentally, that's also Saturday. Okay? We understood that was a length of time people understood. So they said, you know what? The earth was created. God did everything in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Okay? So on the first day, there was, let there be light. Okay? Right? And then we separate the heavens from the earth, and we separate the land from the sea, and then we fill the sea with creatures and all that kind of stuff. It all happens in the same order. Okay? Genesis describes the same order that things appear on earth according to the fossil record. Okay, that science agrees with, right? It's just the time frame that's different. Okay, everybody follow me there, right? So there's really not a lot of disagreements in that, unless you believe that you're supposed to take the Bible literally. Okay, because there's lots of stuff in the Bible that's never meant to be taken literally. I mean, when Jesus was teaching people, he taught by telling stories, right? He taught with parables. Okay. No one was ever meant to take those parables literally. Okay, they were stories that he was using to make a point. Okay, does that make more sense? All right. So what I'm going to tell you today, Don't go to your religion teacher and say, Mr. Gooder said everything you told me was wrong, because I'm not saying that. Okay? All right. So we need to understand how multicellularity evolved. And it actually evolved several times. Okay? The problem is that in Earth's history, there have been several cataclysms, okay, where life on Earth was nearly wiped out. Okay? That's happened a lot of times, actually, in Earth's history. So multicellularity has actually evolved a few times. There's different branches of it. Some branches went extinct. Some branches kept going. Okay? Things like that. Right? Understand the role of specialization. And, man, that is a key term, specialization. Okay? In order to be a true multicellular organism, you have to have specialized cells. That is, all the cells in that organism are not exactly the same. Okay? Some cells are designed to do this, some cells are specialized to do this job. Okay? And we'll be looking in particular at the plant throughout this unit, okay, as an example of a multicellular organism with specialized cells and tissues. Okay? So this lesson kind of bridges the gap between single-celled organisms and plants that we're going to look at. Okay, so multicellularity evolved several times among early eukaryotes. Remember, you have to be eukaryotic to be multicellular because you can't be specialized unless you got organelles in the cells. Okay, if you're a single-celled prokaryotic organism, okay, you can't become specialized. Right, so diverse multicellular algae was an example, would have been one of the first ones. Okay, it also gave rise to plants, animals, and fungi. And the most widely held view is that the links between multicellular organisms and their unicellular ancestors were colonies or loose aggregates of interconnected cells. So the earliest, not true multicellular organisms would have been single-celled organisms that realized there was an advantage in sticking together. Okay? It would have made you bigger and in the eyes of predators then unappealing, because you would have been a larger group, and that would have served a protective function. Okay? It also means that maybe some of those cells that lived in groups, okay, maybe some of them were good at doing something that another one maybe wasn't good at doing, okay, and that would have been the start of specialization. Okay? All right. So, history of the Earth, in brief. Okay? So, 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth is forming. It's a molten ball, okay? Because this is during a period called the Late Heavy Bombardment. Okay? It's just as bad as it sounds. Right? The early solar system was full of just debris, okay? And stuff smashed into each other all the time. But when it smashed into each other, they didn't like turn to powder and just disappear. They would actually get hot and merge and mold together. Right? That's how the planets eventually formed. Just this collection. Okay? The more mass you get, the more gravity you exert. So as these things run into each other, their mass increases, and they attract more pieces of debris, which smash into them and again make them bigger. Okay, and so the more stuff that smashes into you, the more stuff you're going to attract.
Was there a theory that it was like having people longer because they have more mass, which means they have like more gravity around them?
No, the amount of gravity that you or I or even the biggest person on Earth could exert couldn't attract a piece of dust to you by gravity. Okay? Our ability to generate gravitational force is incredibly puny. Actually, I teach it to you in Physics 20. It's like your weight is going to be somewhere around 700 newtons. The amount of gravitational force that you could exert to pull something towards you is like 10 to the minus 9 newtons. Right? It's not enough to pull something. It's always going to be, right? I mean, theoretically, if you got fat enough, food would come to you on its own because of your gravitational pull, but you would have to be almost the size of the Earth for that to happen. Yeah. Okay? Which won't happen, obviously. Okay? All right. So 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth has been just beaten up for a couple of billion years. Okay, it's been collecting all of this mass. Okay, the sun has also been developing, although that's happened billions of years even before that. Okay, and so the Earth now it's getting hit less often, so it's getting a chance to cool. Okay, as the rock cools, some of the gases that have been held around the Earth begin to condense, mostly water vapor. Okay? And as it condenses, it rains onto the surface, which further accelerates the cooling process, okay? And again, begins to collect on the surface as oceans. We start to get a very rudimentary atmosphere, which would have been incredibly toxic. Okay? It would have contained things like ammonia and carbon dioxide and other noxious gases, okay, that most life would not have been able to tolerate. Okay? Also, sorry, around this 4.6 billion years ago time, about 4 billion years ago or so, is actually when the moon was formed, according to our most kind of accurate and most recent theory of how the moon formed. Okay? The moon formed because a Mars-sized object collided with Earth, which was smaller at the time. Okay? It wasn't a head-on collision, it was more of a glancing blow. Okay? And so what happened is both of the objects were essentially, again, liquefied or molten. Okay? But a bunch of the debris, because the collision wasn't head-on, spread into a low orbit around the Earth and also congealed and became the moon. Okay? The reason we believe that is because studies of the moon rocks that we brought back from the Apollo missions, unless you're a conspiracy theorist who think those didn't happen, you're crazy. But they actually tell us that the moon and the Earth are made of the same material. Okay? The only way that that could be true would be if they came from the same object. Right? So they probably came from the same object. That's our most likely scenario. We also know that the moon is getting further away from the Earth all the time. And if we trace that back, it comes back to the point where the Earth and the moon were the same object about that long ago. Okay? So it kind of all fits in there. The other part of it is that the moon is way lighter and way less dense than the Earth is. Because this was a glancing blow, it only got the surface material of the Earth and not the heavy iron core of the Earth. Okay, so the moon is made out of that material instead. Anyway, that's another thing, but that's how the moon formed anyway. Okay, so 3.9 to 3.5 billion years ago, life originates. Okay, we've actually found even more recent fossil evidence, microscopic fossil evidence that says it's even older than that life actually occurred even earlier on than that. Okay, single-celled organisms. Okay, and they would have been photosynthetic. Okay, they would have been using the carbon dioxide, okay, to make sugars for themselves. What are they producing as a byproduct? Oxygen. Okay, now there are other organisms on Earth as well. Okay, they're carrying out other kind of chemical processes that, you know, don't require oxygen, but these are organisms to whom oxygen is toxic. So there was life on Earth back in the very early going that was very different than life on Earth now. Oxygen was toxic to it. Okay, so if we go spin ahead a little bit further along here, okay, photosynthesizing bacteria are pumping large amounts of oxygen now into the atmosphere. And ice age grips the polar regions, okay, and life begins to become more complex. Right around here is where, according to the fossil record, we had our first mass extinction event. Okay. What happened here is all those organisms to whom oxygen was toxic died because the atmosphere reached a tipping point where there was enough oxygen now for essentially all of the ocean water and all of the atmosphere to be so high in oxygen that those organisms died off. Okay? So they all went extinct. But they would have accounted for a large portion of the life on Earth at that time. Okay? Anytime a large portion of life on Earth dies, we call that a mass extinction. Okay? So this first one would have been something like that. Also, the removal of carbon dioxide meant a lesser greenhouse effect. So Earth cooled. Okay? That also would have killed off a few organisms that would have now been outside their habitable temperature range. Okay, we spin ahead here now, 2.1 to 1.9 billion years, oxygen's still building, large single-celled organisms appear, and our first fossil evidence of multicellularity appears. Okay, so multicellular organisms have only been around for about 2 billion years of Earth's 4.5 billion year history. Okay, these are still small kinds of things. Now, on this diagram, you see this purple line here that's getting wider and wider as we go along. Okay, the purple line represents the diversity of life on Earth. That is the number of different kinds of organisms. Okay, you can see that it's kind of thin in the early goings here. Okay, but once multicellularity evolves, look what happens to the line. It starts to get wide pretty fast. Okay, we're still talking at this point, everything is living where? In the ocean. Okay, that's true even kind of down into here. There's really nothing on the land yet. Okay, because, well, there's no soil of any kind. You've got to have stuff there to build up the soil first. Okay. All right, so we go ahead here to about 1 billion years ago, okay, and we start getting more complex organisms. There's obviously the atmosphere is changing still, the ocean is changing, okay, but our first kind of true plants, well, true aquatic plants, start to appear, okay, and when that happens, there's suddenly a lot of food. Okay? And if there's a lot of food in the form of these aquatic plants, now there can be animals. Right here is the start of what we call the Cambrian period. The Precambrian period, Precambrian means before animals. Cambrian means animals. And you can see that once animals evolved, look at the diversity. Okay? We suddenly have two main branches of life, of multicellular organisms, and it just takes off from there. Okay? So you would have seen things like trilobites and worms and your first kind of, well, it's like a scallop. Bivalves is the word I was looking for. Organisms that have a shell but are filter feeders. Okay, your first sponges. Okay, they would have been the first animals. Okay, a sponge is just barely meeting the qualifications of a true multicellular organism. It does have specialized cells, right? But a sponge is very, very simple. In fact, if you run a sponge through a sieve, like force it through a screen, not that you would do that, but okay, if you were to do that, the cells could actually come together on the other side, okay, and go back together. Not in exactly the same shape, but because they're so loosely tied together, they're actually able to do that, okay? So yeah, they're a weird, very simple animal, okay? They're only classified as an animal because they're a filter feeder, so they have little cells inside that make a water current that draws water through, and they filter food particles out of it. Okay, obviously these things are more complex, okay, getting towards the arthropods, okay, this would be the ancestors of like shrimp and lobsters and things like that, okay, flatworms, and our first chordates, those would have been the ancestors of fish, okay, it really kind of took off after that. All right, so the idea here is it took a long time to get to this, but it still follows that same idea that we get, okay, in the Genesis story of the creation of life. Okay, there has to be light first, and then there has to be the separation of land from the sea. Okay, well, earth from the heavens, I guess, would be this part. Okay, and then land from the sea here. Okay, and then the sea filled with life, and the land filled with life, and so on and so on. Yeah, okay, man's way down here. Yeah, definitely on the sixth day. Okay, but definitely later on. Okay? In fact, humans have been around for a very, very short amount of Earth's history. Okay? If you were to make all of Earth's history a 24-hour period, humans appear at 11:59:59. Okay, like we're very late in the history of the Earth. Okay, so what distinguishes a multicellular organism from a colony of cells is division of labor among the cells. That is specialization. This is not a true multicellular organism because all the cells are identical. It's a colony. These are single-celled organisms that are living together for kind of a mutual advantage, but there's no specialization in that organism. Okay? Some of those specializations or adaptations, okay, could result in the contents of the cell actually being different. Right? If you look at the contents of a muscle cell versus the contents of a nerve cell, you will find, I mean, the same organelles, but not in the same numbers. Right? For example, a nerve cell is probably going to have different, similar membranes, but slightly different. But the biggest thing is going to be there's going to be way more cytoskeleton material in a muscle cell because it's got to be elastic and stretch and change shape. And there's going to be way more mitochondria because it's going to use way more energy than a nerve cell. And believe it or not, muscle cells are multinucleate, which means they have more than one nucleus. The reason for that, you tear them all the time. Okay? When you work out, you're actually destroying muscle cells. You're breaking them. Okay? You're breaking the tiny little microfibers in your muscle. And then they heal back together. That's why they need a nucleus on each side. When the thing tears, they got a kind of a nucleus on each side. Yeah, and when they heal back together, they heal stronger. Okay? That makes your muscles stronger, and depending on the type of exercise you're doing, bigger. Okay? If you're doing really heavy stuff, you break more fibers, they grow back bigger. Okay? If you're just doing lighter weights, okay, you won't break as many of the fast twitch fibers, you'll break more of the slow twitch fibers, they come back together but not bigger. Okay? That's all that exercise physiology stuff. Okay? But cells have to have different things in them in order to be specialized to do a certain job. Liver cells, we said the other day, would have way more smooth ER than any other type of cell because their job is to detoxify things. Okay, so as evolution kind of went on, okay, especially early on, there was lots of cellular specialization going on, lots of niches that were being filled, okay, that were available, okay, jobs that needed to be done in the environment, okay, so there were lots of places where a cell or an organism could go and succeed and adapt and things like that, okay. So initially they were colonial aggregates like the organism on the last page there, okay. All cells would have been mobile and had flagella and things like that. Okay, as they became more dependent on each other, they became more like a true multicellular organism. Now, this picture here at the bottom is showing some of the earliest life or fossil evidence that we have of life called stratoliths. Okay, and they're just these mats of cyanobacteria. Okay, and they were some of the earliest life. They would have formed in tidal pools. Okay, places where the tide would go in and out. So there have been times when they were underwater and times when they've been exposed to the air, okay, things like that. Especially early on, you noticed in both of these pictures where the moon is. What do you notice about the moon? It's huge. Why is it huge? Because it's closer, okay? Because it was formed by an impact with the Earth, and we know that it's getting further away all the time, we know that at one point it was much closer. Well, if the moon was closer, then tides would have been greater. Okay, if you've ever been to the Bay of Fundy, right, you've seen like the tides can go out like a few kilometers in that place. Well, imagine that everywhere. Okay, because the moon would have been so much closer, it would have pulled the ocean a lot more to one side. Okay, it would have flooded, you know, huge areas of the continents back then. Okay, all right. Also, it probably wouldn't have been as dark at night on a full moon night, anyway. Okay, and how many times would the moon go around the Earth? Well, it would have gone around more times, right? Because it would be closer. So its orbital period would have been less than it is now. Now the orbital period of the moon is like 28 or 29 days or something like that for it to make one full orbit around the Earth. Okay, but back then it might have done it 2 times a day, okay, being that much closer. So it would have been pretty crazy looking. All right, now looking at examples, what we're going to look at now are examples of specialized cells within the plant. Okay, so we're going to look at all these different things within a plant that do a certain job. Oddly enough, the first cells we're going to look at are unspecialized. They're called parenchyma cells. Okay, parenchyma cells are stem cells. And I don't mean they're in the stem. Some of them are. Okay, I mean that they are stem cells. They can become any type of cell the plant needs. Because plants, unlike ourselves, need to be able to grow all kinds of tissue at any point in response to changing environmental conditions. So maybe on one day a plant needs to grow some root tissue, okay, or it needs to grow a new leaf, or it needs to grow some more stem, or it needs to grow fruit, okay, things like that. So it's got these cells kind of stored everywhere, especially in the fast-growing parts of the plant, that can become any type of cell the plant requires. Okay, so that's why they're called stem cells. It was actually these that gave us the idea for stem cell research in people and animals. Okay, they do contain lots of chloroplasts, okay, because they got to carry out photosynthesis, okay, and they do have fibers in them for support, but they can kind of be found everywhere. They're specialized in that they're unspecialized and can become anything, okay, so they're just an example. They have very thin cell walls, though, because they might become a type of cell that needs a thinner cell wall than others. It's easier to make a cell wall thicker than it is to make it thinner. It's kind of like, you know, you can't cut your hair longer. Right? Once you cut it short, it's too late. Okay, so it's kind of like that. They start out with a thin cell wall because it's easier to make a cell wall thicker than it is to make it thinner. Okay, water conducting cells. Okay, plants obviously have to move water from their roots to their leaves. Okay, and in some plants that's a long way. Okay, in other plants it isn't, but all plants have to be able to do it because water and light are in 2 different places. So these cells need to be specialized so that they hold water and water doesn't leak out. So they have very tight fitting ends. You can see here that they taper. Okay, they taper together and that allows them to get a good tight seal so that water won't leak out. Okay, they also have thick cell walls because they're usually part of the stem, and the stem has to be strong and support weight. Okay, they're also going to be able to secrete things like lignin, which is what makes the trunks, okay, like get hard, right? So they can support more weight. Right, so water conducting cells in the xylem include tapered tracheids on the left here, okay, and vessel elements arranged from end to end forming vessels. So when they form and these cells make it, when they form together, they leave tubes in between, and the tubes are what transport the water. Okay, they're supportive and tightly packed so they prevent leakage. So are they specialized? Yeah, they do a lot of things that other cells in the plant wouldn't do. Plants or cells in the root don't necessarily have to do this. Cells in the leaves don't have to do this. Okay, food conducting cells. You can't have one set of tubes for moving water up and use that same set of tubes to transport food down. That's like having two trains going the opposite direction on the same track. Okay, it's not going to work. So what we have is one set of tubes that carries water, the xylem ones we just talked about, and one set of tubes that carries food, the phloem. Okay, now, what does food look like for a plant? Sugary sap. Okay, if you've ever had like maple syrup, that came from what, like real maple syrup, not Aunt Jemima or Mrs. Butterworth. Okay, that's fake syrup. Okay, real maple syrup. Okay, it is actually made from the sap of maple trees. So they take the sap, they harvest the sap out of there. Okay, they process it obviously a little bit, make it a bit thinner because it's quite thick when it comes out of the tree. Okay, and that can be used for obviously making pancakes and waffles taste better, right? But it's full of sugar, sugar that the plant has produced using photosynthesis, right? That's how it transports all of the sugars made by photosynthesis to the parts of the plant that can't carry out photosynthesis. What parts of the plant can't carry out photosynthesis? The roots, okay? I mean, you might see in root cells chloroplasts, but not many, and they can't do anything because they're underground where it's dark, right? So they have to be supplied with food by the leaves. Conversely, the leaves don't have access to water. They have to be supplied with it by the roots. So, okay, we've got these two systems of tubes that are transporting stuff in opposite directions. The trunk of a tree is actually mostly dead. Only the outer layer, which is where this is, the phloem, is actually living cells. The xylem is actually old phloem cells that have, as they die, they become tapered and they make the xylem. Okay, but that's why lumber on the inside, like where we get lumber from wood, is hard. Right? It's the old stuff. A tree always grows from the outside. That's why you get rings. Right? When you cut down a tree, you see the rings. The ring marks the outside of the tree each growing season. Right? So it always grows from the outside. If a tree grew from the inside, it would always crack because it would push the outer stuff out of the way. So it always grows by adding a new layer of cells to the outside of the tree, so we see the rings as it grows. Yep, you can tell how old a tree is, and they've been doing lots of tree ring studies now on really old trees that have been cut down or that have fallen down that allow them to do backtrack climate trends, because they can tell various widths of the rings. Like if two rings are really close together, the tree didn't grow very much that year. If there's a whole bunch of rings really close together, then something happened that slowed the growth of trees over that span. And then maybe you've got a few that are really wide. Well, then there was a few years in a row where the tree grew really well. Okay, so they can kind of backtrack climate trends with doing that. Okay, so these food conducting cells, okay, they're hollow and they're wide, okay, and they have what are called sieve plates, okay. Every once in a while there's basically just a screen. You want to have those screens there because this sap is full of sugar. And if sugar has a tendency to crystallize if it starts to lose water. Well, if you get a big crystal forming in one of those tubes, what's it going to do? It'll block it. So we've got these sieve plates that when a crystal is moving down, if it hits one of those sieve plates, the weight of the sap above will crush it and keep it from getting too big and blocking the tube. Okay, so then it'll fall through the sieve plate and we don't have those problems. All right, so food conducting cells of the phloem, okay, they're specialized to move sugar around. Okay, they have porous walls so that the sugar can get out and go to all of the cells nearby. Okay. Now, here's the most important part, leaf structure. This is the best example of specialization in any organism there is, really. Okay? You looked at this yesterday in the cell anatomy lab. Okay? Here was the top layer of square-looking cells that I told you to find. Okay? Underneath is the spongy layer of cells. Okay? These are the ones that you drew. Well, all of these cells are specialized to do a certain job. The top layer of the leaf, which we didn't pay much attention to, okay, which you can see kind of right here, okay, that's the epidermis. Those cells don't carry out photosynthesis. In fact, they have very few, if any, chloroplasts in them. Their job is to prevent the loss of water from the leaf by secreting a waxy cuticle. Okay? If you've ever felt the leaf of a plant, it feels kind of waxy. If water drops on the leaf of a plant, it just beads and sits there. It doesn't absorb. Okay? Part of that is so that when the wind blows or whatever, the water will run off, hit the ground next to the plant, and the roots will absorb it. Okay? The leaves have no ability to absorb water. They don't want to have any ability to absorb water, because if they can absorb it, they can lose it. All right? Everybody follow me there? Okay? A moss doesn't have a waxy cuticle. So if you put a moss in the sun in the space of an hour, it goes from being moist to being crunchy. Okay? It can't prevent the loss of water. But other plants can, because they secrete this waxy cuticle that seals the leaf completely. All right? So that's what the waxy cuticle, that's the waxy cuticle right there. It's secreted by the upper epidermis. Okay? So you guys have this diagram? Highlight it. I'm going to show you like 5 different versions of this diagram in the second half of this unit, okay? Because it is all about how plants work, but it's also about specialization and multicellularity. Okay, so you got the upper epidermis, okay, and it secretes the waxy cuticle. Underneath that is the layer of cells that you are putting in your cell anatomy lab, and that is the palisade layer. Okay? The palisade layer, those cells are packed really, really tight. Okay? You can see here they're all linear, but they're packed way more tightly than the cells are down here. Right? That's because this is the layer that carries out photosynthesis. The job of this layer of the leaf is to carry out photosynthesis. Those cells have more chloroplasts in them than any other cells do. Okay? That is primarily their job. Okay? They are the food producers of the entire plant. That's why they're also on the top of the leaf. Okay? It's the top of the leaf that receives the most sunshine. Okay? So they get packed in there. They're specialized in that they have more chloroplasts than any other. Underneath that is the spongy layer. Okay? And the spongy layer is essentially where carbon dioxide and oxygen get exchanged, so gases get exchanged in the spongy layer, and where water can be kind of temporarily stored. Water has to evaporate for photosynthesis to occur. Okay, now the spongy layer does that because on the bottom of the leaf there's another layer of epidermis, another waxy cuticle, but there are also these little specialized cells in the epidermis. They're called the guard cells. 2 guard cells together make a stomate. A stomate is a hole. Okay, it's a hole in the leaf. Will water be able to escape through that hole? Yes, so can carbon dioxide and oxygen. That's where all the gas exchange occurs, is through these stomates. Why aren't there any on the top? Well, it might let stuff in, but that's not really our worry if stuff got in. Okay, partly it would take up surface area for photosynthesis, but what side of the leaf gets the most sun? The top. If you had the openings on the top, would you lose more water? That's why they're on the bottom. Okay? It's way smarter to have the places where water is going to escape and gases are going to be exchanged to be in the shaded part than on the sunny part. Okay? You'll lose less water that way. All right? So these, the guard cells that make up the stomates, are also specialized to do a certain job. They don't do a lot of photosynthesis, but they can change their shape to open or close the hole. Right? When the plant has lots and lots of water, when the plant has lots and lots of water, the water vacuoles in these stomate or these guard cells, what happens is it pushes on the cell wall so much that the cell achieves this bean shape. Okay, so when the plant's got lots of water, the stomates open because the 2 cells can't stick together; they're forced apart. As the plant loses water during the day through evaporation, okay, osmosis happens, and it begins to draw water out of the vacuole. And when the water vacuole starts to empty, the cell's not as rigid, and that closes the stomate. So it's not a conscious thing. The plant doesn't go, oh, hey, everybody close the stomates, it's getting hot outside. Okay? It can't do that. It doesn't have a brain, doesn't have the ability to do that. This is just a natural process that happens because of osmosis and evaporation. Okay? But these cells are specialized to do that job. Okay? This is one process that you are definitely going to need to be able to explain to me, because it's one of the ways plants regulate water loss. Okay? It involves specialized cells, it involves regulation of water. Okay? Those stomates, guard cells, can change shape, open and close. Okay? This is what they look like, incidentally, under a microscope. Okay, here on the left. Okay, so so water loss, here, we'll just underline the part that's important here. Okay, you might want to work in there that the way that they do this, the increasing or decreasing of the water levels, okay, that is caused by osmosis. So essentially, it's not something that's under conscious control. It's a result of a passive process, which is good. That passive process is going to cause a plant to lose less water. Okay? Overnight, the plant can regain its water levels because the sun's not shining on it. It's not carrying out the light reactions that require water to evaporate. Okay? And so those cells will fill up. By morning, the stomates will be open. Okay? By kind of mid to late afternoon, when it's starting to get really hot, the plant will have lost enough water that the stomates will have lost water from their vacuoles by osmosis and closed the holes. Okay? Everybody with me there? All right, so are we seeing this specialization? Okay, so if we go back to this diagram, this is another leaf layer diagram. It actually shows a stomate on the top, which is very rare. Okay, most of the time the stomates are just on the bottom. Okay, again, you can see the palisade cells that have lots of chloroplasts. Their job's to carry out photosynthesis. The spongy cells here, they have irregular shape. That's part of their specialization. Their shape is irregular so that they don't fit tightly together. If they don't fit tightly together, there's spaces in between the cells. Those spaces then can hold water vapor or liquid water, carbon dioxide and oxygen, okay, and allow that exchange to occur, because the stomates usually are connected to a space within those cells. Or sorry, not within, between those cells, sorry. Right? Other specialized cells you can see in here, we got the xylem and phloem are labeled as well. Okay, the xylem is always kind of in the middle of the veins. Okay, that's carrying the water. So the water comes through the xylem and actually has to move through the phloem in order to supply the other cells with water. And that's also important because as long as water is moving through the phloem, the sap doesn't get too thick. Okay? Now, that's also an adaptation that plants have, especially here, for winter. Okay? When plants lose their leaves in the fall, what do they stop moving? Water. Water is only going to move to the top of a plant because photosynthesis is causing it to be drawn up there. Okay? As you lose it, it moves up. Okay? It's actually osmosis that causes that to happen too, which we'll talk about later. Okay? But then with the water no longer moving through, you don't have to worry about water being in the sensitive parts of the plant and freezing and expanding and cracking the plant open. Okay? So the plants lose their leaves so that no more water gets transported. The water all just kind of settles to the bottom or just is gone completely, and that causes the phloem sap to then get thicker. And as a result, because it's full of sugar, it won't freeze. Okay, the plants stop producing sugar, so there's less phloem sap in the phloem anyway because the leaves are gone. Okay, what sap is still there is so thick and so sugary that it won't freeze. Okay. All right. I think you got time to answer those 4 questions, and we'll probably still have time to go over them. So let's give those a whirl. Why would it have been an advantage to be multicellular over being unicellular? What do you think? Multicellular organisms are generally what compared to single-celled? Larger. Bigger was better. In almost every case, okay, bigger was better because you had more prey options if you were a predator and you were big. Okay? If you were not a predator and were big, less things wanted to eat you because maybe you were just too big to eat. Okay? So being multicellular and allowing them to get big, that was a big deal. It allowed them to overcome what we're going to talk about tomorrow, which was the problem of being big but having to move things by diffusion. If you're multicellular, you're big, but you're made up of small cells. So you don't have to worry about diffusion not being good over large distances. You're made of many small cells that don't have that problem, okay, as opposed to being really big and single-celled. So, okay, it's a huge advantage there. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, okay? And it would have also allowed you to become specialized, which means you would have done things better than a single-celled organism in the same place, okay? How are the cells of a leaf different from cells found in the stem of a plant? What are things in the stem going to have more of than, let's say, cells in the leaf? Peter? Yeah, they're going to have more chloroplasts. Okay? The leaves are the photosynthetic organ of the plant. And while the stem might carry out some photosynthesis, that's not its primary job. Okay? Cells in the stem are going to have more cellulose, bigger water vacuoles. They got to do more support work than photosynthetic work. So their structure is going to lean more towards supporting lots of weight than it is toward carrying out photosynthesis. Okay, describe how the epidermis and the stomates have similar jobs. Okay, so we said the epidermis secretes the waxy cuticle, and the stomates control the amount of water that gets in and out of the plant. Are they both doing the same job? Yeah, they're both helping to conserve water. And if I ever give you a question on a test that says, describe some adaptations a plant has that helps limit its loss of water, you should probably mention both. Okay? And I would also look at things like maybe where are the stomates located generally? Top of the leaf, bottom of the leaf. Why does that help with that situation? So, okay, those are things you want to think about. Okay, and describe how the stomate works. We just got done doing that. Okay, the water vacuoles, when they're full, cause a change in shape of the guard cells that results in the stomate being open. Throughout the day, as water is lost, osmosis pulls water from the vacuole. They lose that shape, and the stomate closes. Okay, so those are the important things we need to know for that.